All right, you got gun violence, climate change down yet? Nope. Do we have gun violence is here? Thank you. Death penalty? Gun violence is in the house. All right. Abortion? Money in politics? Now I heard that was challenging. Money in politics tough? Who had money in politics? No, certain things have background knowledge, which is tough. So money in politics, you've got to understand corporate giving, PACs. Citizens United that passed the Supreme Court changed politics, the landscape of politics today. No question about that. No question. It shows you the power of one thing and what it can do. That one decision changed everything. It hasn't mattered yet. But the flow of corporate money and PACs. There was a limit of it. It was never really organized on a major level. Yeah, this is a big business. All right, we all down? All right, hand it back to the boss.
So as Jeffrey was saying, we know these are tough issues. These are things that people have been working on for decades and some of the most contentious issues of our time. So we appreciate your willingness to grapple with them. We know we're not going to solve them today, but we hope that this gives you a schema to think about them and to think about how you can create change and what to look for when you're reading about things. And we always say, if you leave with more questions than answers, that's a good thing because you have the rest of your lives to continue your inquiry into them. So we're going to do 3 to 5 minute presentations. We encourage it to be 3 if possible. We're going to go in the order that we have up here. After each presentation, we'll take 2 questions from the fellows and from our speakers, from Eric and John. And then we'll have time for some synthesis and some questions and answers for Eric and John. So can we have climate change? Excellent.
It's fine, we can just pass it. We got it. Yeah, we can just, yeah. Hi, folks. So we're going to go over kind of like the last few, the barriers and constraints, strategies, and key points, just give like a very, very brief overview. But a lot of the barriers and constraints we were talking about related to climate change. Oh, that too, sorry. I'm Olivia, I go to Fieldston.
I'm Maya, I go to Packer.
I'm Rosemary, I go to Fieldston.
So a lot of the barriers and constraints, something we were talking about is the socioeconomic aspect of climate change. A lot of people are involved in jobs related to the fossil fuel industries and that are tied to the causes of climate change. And so what's going to happen to them and priorities, putting food on the table for my family is more important than this like general idea that's been brought up in the media.
Another issue is the budgeting, like federal budgeting. For example, what would you rather invest money to research to prevent climate change or like for other things like defending the country or something?
We talked a bit about rebranding the message that is sent to like civilians and how oftentimes we see climate change as like a distant issue, but to show more of climate change like in motion, the way it's affecting people currently. And also we talked about the difference between mitigation and adaptation and how rather than like trying to stop climate change from happening, we need to talk about adapting to it because it's going to happen regardless.
Making multifaceted plans. Another key point in our conversation was education and how do we integrate climate change or ideas surrounding climate change into educational curriculum. Is that through lobbying at the Department of Education to have it more of a focal point in public school education, or is it even having it in picture books for little kids so this fluency starts at a really young age? We didn't know how to go about it, but we thought that education was really, really important in this issue and making it more relevant, even though it's affecting all of us.
And last point, we also have social media, which is a huge factor, especially with the new generations. And as a face of an opposing person against climate change, who believes it's fake, we obviously have our president, which is a huge problem because, you literally pull up your phone and you'll see his face on the, thinking that it's false, and that's just not the case.
Short and sweet.
I can take 2 questions. Anyone have a question?
How would you guys, in designing a campaign or mobilizing people around the issue, how will you deal with, or what would your proposal be to confront the issue of polarization? Because people are all or nothing on the issue. How do you create a space or create room to be solution driven, and so that and move past the polarization aspect?
Well, I think a basis of climate change is just, it's not a polarized issue, right? Like, eventually this will affect everybody. And so I think based on our education factor, we first have to help them understand that it's not a left-wing ideology. Like the Green Deal, we talked about that. It makes climate change sound like it's only for left-wing, the party.
A fear we had was that this Green New Deal was going to make it seem like climate change was a fad for liberals when it's really, a national and global issue. I think how do you unite people, because it is a polarized issue, is somehow rebranding, rephrasing the issue to be like, it's not just the polar ice caps. It's relevant in our everyday lives, but how can we present it as more than just facts and figures that bore the public? So somehow creating this space of facts, but engaging.
Right now in my head, I'm imagining if you were to make a video of a fridge and almost look at it as your tomatoes are from here and this is what's going on with climate change here, or the cotton in your shirt is from this place and water is running out in this area, and showing how the stuff that's going on currently.
Would you attach a cost to that?
I would say so, yeah. Or in the distant future, this might not exist at all.
Did we try that with Brandon?
Didn't really work.
We can do one more question for our climate change aficionados. Question? They've been this comprehensive? Yes, Becky.
What do you do with the question of people who are living on the coasts and losing their property because of climate, because of erosion, because of the water encroachment? Because that is a political, both a property rights issue, is a lot of issues. And how would you deal with that branding, that particular question?
For me, I'm thinking back to the adaptation versus mitigation. I think with that situation, it's more towards adaptation and telling people that either they have to move or it's expensive. I don't know how to, I feel I would imagine those people already bought into the idea of climate change and reform around that. So I'm not, and I don't know if that answered your question, but.
It's bringing awareness, right?
Yeah.
But I think some of these are really urgent humanitarian crises, because at the end of the day, when you don't have a house, that is a major issue. We didn't really cover this in our conversation, but I think at this point, the government does have to intervene in terms of relocating people, because when your citizens don't have houses, and it's not, their fault, it's natural causes, something has to change.
I think there's actually a huge opportunity in that so many of the states that are going to be affected by this are in conservative control. So if you can frame this as a cost and property issue, take it out of the equation whether you think it's man-made or whether you think it is God-made or whether you think it's made by corporations or whatever. Anyone can understand my property is losing value, my home is losing value, there's flooding, etc. So when you look at states like Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, those are all places where you can use a different argument, and that's something people aren't doing, and there's a lot of room to do it.
for gun violence. Give it up for gun violence. Yeah. I can hold this in here. Give it. Gun violence, introduce yourselves. Turn it on.
Hi, I'm Alex. I go to Baruch.
I'm Julie. I go to Grace Church.
Hi, I'm Jassity. I go to School of the Future.
So our topic was gun violence and necessarily how to prevent that and the controls going on around that. So we said there's a couple of issues that are preventing major legislation from being passed. We have different kind of categories here, what that drives. So the first one we have is political drivers, and why is this not being passed in Congress, and what's the issues preventing that? So we said a couple of issues. First is the constituents and what they believe they have the right to have. Now, the big issue that we said is that it's the AR-15s. That's what currently we're talking about in Congress, background checks. So why do people want to have AR-15s? What's the background behind that? What's the constituents? Why do they care? So AR-15s, I'm not a hunter. Quite sure you don't need a 30 magazine clip to kill animals, but why do people still have them? Why are there so many, and why do people not push back against that? And we said that it's because they are afraid of government tyranny, and that a big issue of our Second Amendment is government tyranny. And that's a reason why they had that, in that if legislation is ever passed saying that you cannot have AR-15s, and you go to the person who owns an AR-15, who has that gun for the express purpose of defending themselves against people trying to take away their rights, and someone comes and says, I want to take away your right to own this gun, that might cause an issue.
For the economic drivers, we talked about like changing the message, because like there's a difference between gun violence prevention and then gun violence control. And then we also talked about like we should find out the reason for why people own a gun, and then take that reason and the why, and then like maybe make a more impactful change.
So to add on to that, we spoke about how it's super important to acknowledge the other side, and why, yeah, like you said, people are for guns. And someone in our group mentioned how it's not all or nothing. We don't have to just have guns or not have guns. We can come up with like some sort of like restrictions for guns, like that will like be like everyone can agree upon. Like not everyone, of course, but like it'll like make us all most people feel more comfortable.
And then there's the cultural aspect of it, which we really got into, and that we think is really important, in that we are all from the North, and we're here not from the North, do tell me. And we don't grow up around firearms. We're not accustomed to firearms. We're not taught firearm safety. A lot of it's foreign to us. But people in the South, in the West, they're used to firearms. They grow up with firearms. For their 12th birthday, they might get like a shotgun. No one here has a shotgun for their 12th birthday. So it's really hard to understand, and that if we're able to kind of bridge the gap between people in the North and what they think of firearms, people in the South and West and what they think about firearms, that if we can just start talking about it and maybe try to understand that we don't know everything about them, they don't know everything about us, that we can try to find some middle ground. And that polarization is a huge issue in our country, but how can we end that? By talking and understanding our differences.
Okay, do we have any questions for gun violence?
Oh, awkward, sorry. I thought it was going to you, and I was like, oh wait, it's me. So at our school, we had a forum on gun control, and there was a guy who's actually a big supporter of the right to bear arms, and obviously the Second Amendment right. And what he was talking about was it is inevitable that people will have guns, but an aspect of education is that it should be in school curriculum. What do you think are the cultural implications of that? Having gun safety taught as a class or as an elective in a school?
Well, culturally, once again, we're not accustomed to firearms. I don't think that it will be, that it's not in South never. But that it might help in that you might not necessarily want to shoot guns. You might not ever want to be around guns. But having a respect and mutual understanding for guns is really important. I went to camp every year, and I went shooting at a firearm range, and I was shooting. And I, from the North, learned how how to respect firearms and the safety of it and how it's a very dangerous weapon, but you can also control it and use it in a positive manner. And that would be really important for some people who the idea of firearms is like a big scary concept. And we kind of like ease into it in a way that's educational.
Yeah, I also think that's like important. Like we should have like schools teach that, because then we can make sure we're giving guns to the right people. And
Other questions?
What about the sort of legislative aspect? Okay, you were talking about polarization. What would be your idea to find a place where, if not all, then kind of 90% of people agree?
Well, right now the two sides are very, very different, as you well know. We're not exactly sure how to bridge the divide. It's so huge. So the first step would try to be to stop calling each other names in sessions of Congress and maybe try to have some more civility back into the issue. But in terms of maybe like a smaller legislation, try to start some bipartisanship, try to work to a common goal, maybe try to break down the barriers between Republican and Democrat.
Could that be something around, let's say, background checks or mental health attention?
No, mental health, that's a big one actually. I'm not sure, I'm not exactly talking for all the Republican constituents, but mental health is a huge issue. A lot of people who do commit violent acts may not be properly diagnosed, but shooting 57 people at a concert and having no background in psychopath, whatever. So we could totally think that both sides would be able to agree that violently, mentally ill people shouldn't have high magazines, thinning rifles.
Okay, we're going to move on. Two questions. Sorry. Thank you. Gun violence. Death penalty. Come on up. Thank you, guys. Death penalty. Do we have death penalty? Introduce yourself.
I'm Lior. I go to Baruch.
I'm Tanya. I go to Mohawk Bronx High School.
When we were talking about the political drivers of death penalty, we were talking about how there's a lot of lack of coverage in it with like political leaders. We're thinking it's mostly because it doesn't really affect their audiences, because their audiences aren't really people in jail or on death row.
When we discussed economic drivers, we talked about how expensive it was and how it's $90,000 of tax money per person that's in death row. So like that's something to take in consideration because it's really expensive. And not only that, but the reason why it's so expensive is because of the many appeals that occur. So like when someone is placed on death row, I guess they appeal for it, which is also a long process and it's very expensive.
Adding on, a lot of innocent people could end up on death row because of either bad representation or a biased judge, and like those people might never actually get a chance to prove their innocence because the judge already made the decision that they're on death row and they end up being killed.
We also saw a statistic that 42% of people who are placed on death row are black, as well as 42% of people who are placed on death row are white. And even though they are equal percentage, black people they're like less. I'm saying that so wrong. There's more white people than black, so the fact that that their percentage is equal is kind of startling. And people who are convicted of killing a white man are 3 times likely to be placed on death row.
We have some questions for our death penalty folks. Any questions about death penalty and how to create change around it?
So I'm Olivia, I go to Poly Prep in Brooklyn. So in this campaign, so just out of curiosity, are you guys advocating to get rid of the death penalty, or are you advocating that there's just more universal policy concerning the death penalty? And then, depending on your response, which like partnerships would you guys make? Like what groups would you guys talk to if you were to take a certain stance on the issue?
We tried to discuss both sides, but overall we were kind of leaning for completely against the death penalty. And for key partnerships, we talked about Innocence Project. I think that was one of them. They're like against that, and death penalty UK. So it's not only in the issue in the US, but also like in the UK.
Is there any stats that show that death penalty has helped reduce crime?
Well,
I'm not sure you guys have time. I'm just curious.
yeah.
I don't think that there can be stats about that because if they're dead, they obviously can't commit another crime.
I'm saying is stats that show that prevents others from wanting to do it.
You want? So I don't think it's an isolated situation necessarily, because death penalty usually only involves one person, and general population and crime often involves other inmates. So I don't know the statistics on that, but I would say that I don't think it actually prevents crime from happening.
No, I think my question, I think my primary question is,
Uh-huh.
if so-and-so murdered 5 people and was put to death,
Uh-huh.
found guilty, put to death, does that cause other people to not want to cause that crime? Does death penalty act as prevention?
I think it acts as like maybe like a barrier, something that you wouldn't want to do because it's like a consequence of something, it's a consequence of your actions. So I'm not sure on the statistics of that. I would say that it's a kind of a fear factor, so it's something that's going to maybe prevent you from doing that because there's that downside that you might actually get put on death row.
Also, I would like to comment that I feel like if we are gonna have the death penalty, and if that is gonna be like a legal thing, then I feel like we should ensure that the people who are placed on death row or are given the death penalty are given so like rightfully, because there's a lot of people who are placed on death row and are killed even though the fact that they're innocent. So I feel like if we are gonna have that, then we should somehow ensure that they're killed, but rightly so.
We have 2 more groups and we want to have Q&A, so unless these are burning questions.
Still like the deterrent thing. Like no statistics show that the death penalty is a deterrent for crime. It just there's like absolutely no evidence for that. It doesn't work. The only thing that would like be an argument for the death penalty is just vindictive, like using it as like a punishment for a crime rather than like I don't know.
Rehabilitation.
Yeah.
Just something quick, like also if you think about it, we haven't really even come up with an effective system for the death penalty. We still have botched situations, and I know I've read like stories about like botched lethal injections and how much pain these people go through, which they're not supposed to, and like so we haven't, if like personally going back, there are no statistics to show that it's effective. So if we are going to keep it, then what's the point if it's not effective and we can't even come up with a way to put these people to death like in a respectful manner and not like put them through even more pain?
The one way it is a deterrent is used by prosecutors for negotiating for pleading. So while it's not maybe like, oh, if I get caught, I could be put to death, it is used by prosecutors once they're caught. I'm not saying whether I agree or not with it, I'm just saying that is how it's often used. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Death penalty. Abortion. From death to...
Okay, hi, my name's Olivia. I go to Poly Prep in Brooklyn.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I go to Fieldston.
And so our topic of conversation was abortion. So since this is a really complicated issue, we're just going to break it down into the little groups that we had on this sheet of ours. So as far as the political drivers that prevent abortion rights from being advanced or from like pro-life legislation getting through, we talked a lot about how the issue is very polarized right now. So a lot of the times we see conservative politicians leaning towards advancing pro-life legislation, whereas we see the more liberal side of we see more liberal politicians promoting policies that are pro-choice.
As well, there's like the economic aspect to it, like who funds it? Like there's state funding for hospitals and like access to like healthcare facilities. So with laws like Title X, which is going into like debate currently, how will like facilities that provide abortions get the funding they need? And then you also have super PACs, which are like funding politicians and giving them the ability to get elected if they vote against access to abortion. So it's a very multifaceted and complex like issue, both economically and socially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just building off of that point concerning religion, as far as like the cultural devices that are used to kind of stop pro-choice legislation from going through, we mentioned how a lot of the time religion is a really big factor in like passing legislation concerning abortion, and how a lot of people justify going against abortion or like helping legislation that is pro-life go through is because of their religious beliefs. But as far as issues concerning like pro-choice, we talked about how a lot of celebrities have come out in favor of pro-choice legislation and pro-choice movements. For example, a lot of celebrities have started to donate money to Planned Parenthood under Mike Pence's name. And so we talked about just how a lot of celebrities have that kind of cultural influence in concerning like what people believe concerning abortion.
So in terms of like legal drivers, there's a lot of things happening. So you have the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which basically says that every American citizen is guaranteed equal protection under the law. So when does a fetus become an American citizen and get the protection under the law? Is it at conception or is it at birth? So there's that going on. There's also Roe v. Wade and the right to privacy aspect of it. And then in terms of on the state level, state laws have the ability to create clinics or destroy them. Like for example, in Mississippi, there's only one abortion clinic left in the entire state, and that was a state decision. And then in conservative states like Ohio and a couple of, Ohio and where else?
Yeah, in like Tennessee. In Iowa, yeah, in Texas. So basically, like a lot of like southern states or just states that are kind of like in the Midwest of America, they tend to remove a lot of funding for abortion clinics. And a lot of the times, the clinics, like the amount of resources that are allocated towards giving abortions is such a small percentage. Most of the time, it's actually about women's health care and giving out contraceptives and stuff, and consultations about like family planning. So a lot of the times, the states kind of just use the fact that like some clinics give abortions in order to completely defund them when that's not even their real main purpose. So then just concerning the key partnerships, if we were to create a campaign that's kind of advocating for pro-choice legislation, we would really try to branch out to clinics that are affected by like pro-choice funding and stuff. And then we would also try and get more progressive religious activists in on this, considering that a lot of the time people who are opposed to abortion are religious. We would try and get people who are religious but actually are in support of abortion so that we can kind of have that counterweight towards those who are super religious and oppose it. And then we are also thinking about getting more moderate Republicans or more moderate libertarians in on this issue and trying to get them to also support the pro-choice movement. And we would kind of try and frame it in the sense that a lot of the time they believe that government intervention is something that's wrong, and they want smaller governments and they want less regulations, and yet they support more government regulations concerning abortions. So we were going to try and frame it in a sense that's like saying that this is kind of like against what you actually believe because you want less government interference.
Just to add quickly, I would love to see like a bipartisan coalition discussing pro-choice and kind of its impact and adding to that type of like realm and showing that it can be an issue that's not just a liberal issue or a conservative issue, but a humanitarian issue in general. So in terms of citizen mobilization, changing the narrative, so getting the stories out there, like having women who have had abortions share their experiences and really say that they didn't do it because they really wanted to, but it was out of necessity. As well, talking about how pro-choice, in many ways supports family values because it allows people to make educated decisions about the families they're building, which is a key piece.
It's a biggie. Thanks for putting so much in. We have 2 questions for abortion. Folks?
So you mentioned before how this is a very polarized issue. Is there at all common ground? Because one side's arguing for no, or maybe not no abortion, but like really restricted abortion. The other side, not everyone on the other side, but also bills such as like 9-month pregnancies that we have here in New York. You can abort 9-month pregnancies. So if there is a middle ground, what is it?
Okay, just a little quick fact check. There's no like 9-month abortions. And there's also like no such thing as like partial birth abortions either, just to like fact check some stuff. So I would say that the topic of abortion is not as polar. When I said that it was polarized, I didn't mean that there is no like kind of fluidity concerning the opinions surrounding abortion. For example, there are some conservative people.
Tomi Lahren.
Oh yeah, Tomi Lahren, for example, conservative but basically she's completely she's pro-choice and she is a very outspoken conservative. And so when I said that it was polarized, I didn't mean in the sense that all Republicans are against abortion, that all Democrats are for it. Rather, no, I'm just saying I think that generally there's actually a lot of fluidity concerning the issue, and some are kind of for abortions in cases of like rape and incest, and there are some people who think that once the second trimester arrives that women should like not be allowed to have abortions anymore. So I'd say it's really complicated, and that's why we were speaking so much before about
And
it.
in terms of common ground between both sides of the issue, I had the opportunity to talk to some very pro life advocates. They do believe in a lot of consent education, which I think is a key part of the pro-choice movement in general. The understanding that you have the right to say yes or no to something, and bringing that education to schools was something they were a big proponent of. So there is common ground. So thinking about like the issues and parts of the issue where compromise can be achieved, because I really do believe that's possible.
Other questions?
You were talking a little bit about how to, like, the way a lot of people who are pro-life want less government regulation, and how, like, abortion is more government regulation. So how would you phrase that so that it's not like you're being a hypocrite, and it's more so like,
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I think that a lot of the time the issue of abortion is something that is it's really emotional. And so I think that a lot of the time people aren't necessarily exposed to all of the facts and the histories of the issue. So for example, like I think that speaking about abortion, I think that mostly, I think that we should basically just frame it in terms of the Constitution and in terms of like past judicial precedents. So I think that just saying, like abortion is something that is basically protected under like the, protections of like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I think that just framing it in terms of our like judicial past and in terms of our legislative past might be a way to kind of convince more people to, get in on the issue. Okay. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, abortion. Money in politics. The uncomplicated issue of money in politics.
Hello. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So money in politics. It's really tough. So I think before we start talking about how we're gonna fix the current landscape of money in politics, we have to talk about where it's at right now, right? So in the past 10 years, there was this the Supreme Court decision called Citizens United, which effectively said that corporations could act like citizens and therefore had free expression rights to give as much money as they wanted to any given candidate, right? So that really opened the floodgates towards deregulating campaign finance. So some of the campaign finance reform from the late 20th century was sort of coming down in the 2000s, but once Citizens United hit, it was really, really tough to regulate it, right? They removed like caps on individual spending. So effectively, where we're at right now is like based on classifications of different types of like non-profits or like political organizations or interest groups. You're effectively able to give as much money as you want to any given candidate. And like there are certain restrictions on that, but they're pretty loose. So I think the main challenge, other than like this constitutional or judicial like precedent, is accountability, right? So the same people that you were electing and the same people who benefit off of the money that they're receiving are the ones who get to decide the legislation on like how campaign finance works, right? For example, like the FEC is the governing body that like really regulates like the day-to-day aspects of campaign finance. The selection process for the FEC is through the Senate, right? And like although the president nominates candidates for the FEC, like almost no FEC candidate that does not oppose campaign finance reform ever gets through, right? The process, right? Because like senators benefit off of like a lot of money. And this is not like a symmetric issue, right? Like the right has consistently spent a lot more money on campaigns and through PACs than Democrats have over the past however many of years. So it's really tough. But that's not to say that there's no space for really fixing the issue, right? Like there have been laws in the past that cap people's spending based off of the premise of like either national security or just like democracy, right? Like somebody having the ability to give more money to a campaign effectively means that they have like more influence or more importance within that election. And although it's not like an explicit violation of democracy, right? Like it's still one person, one vote, or however much of that actually exists in the United States. Like because of the electoral system of the United States, money makes a very big difference, right? So congressional candidates who can get out and shake as many hands as possible will likely have better turnout, right? And turnout's like really the name of the game when getting elected, right? Like if you get people to come out and vote for you, then you're getting elected more than if you just like have your base and you're able to energize that base or expand that base a little bit more. So I mean, like the bottom line is most Americans agree that the way campaign finance works right now is undemocratic because people who have a lot more money are able to donate to campaigns and effectively bankroll them, can also influence candidates' agendas. The issue is that the people who are accountable for changing that are the people who are benefiting off of that system. So I would advocate for a more independent, I guess, like campaign examination. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions for Money in Politics?
Will you propose attacking this, or what do you think would have more impact? Placing caps at the state level or at the federal level? Where do you think we can create more change?
So before Citizens United, the majority of states actually allowed like a lot of corporate donations, right? So I think since the age that it was made into a national issue through Citizens United, I think like it needs a national response. And that's not to say that like state solutions can't be effective, because by like breaking corporations up into states, it can like really change the landscape, right? Like it's less of a unified front on a national election or like state elections, but from a national scale. But I think like national laws or a national body would really be important, especially since the history of it has been so, I guess, universal throughout the United States.
Hi, Simon.
Hi, Olivia.
Okay. So what would you do in convincing those who believe that corporations having the ability to donate money is just like the epitome of American like individualism and like freedom of expression? Like how would you convince them that implementing campaign finance regulations is a good idea?
All right, so if we're talking about like purely Citizens United versus like capping individual spending, so like I would say that like to those corporations who want to give as much money as they want, I would say that your CEO can give as much money as they want, right? Like as an individual, you're allowed to donate. That is not the same thing as having an organized group that is collectively creating money for the sole purpose of like helping your business, which is like one of the issues with like corporate spending So I take less issue. That's not to say no issue at all, but I take less issue with individual spending. I take a lot more issue with organizing it for the sake of a business. Individuals are not corporations. Like, you just can't say that, like, you can't incorporate the Bill of Rights into a corporation. I just don't think that's, like, good standing for a Supreme Court decision. But apparently that's what they thought.
Thank you to all 5 of our groups for taking on, again, some of the toughest issues of our time. What we're going to ask now is for John and Eric to join and to give some responses to what you heard and some further advice. We got a little bit of a late start today, so we're going to ask if you can give us 5 or 10 more minutes so that we can really do a full synthesis, ask any burning questions you have. We'll also pass out pieces of paper so that if you have questions that you want to raise with John and Eric that you don't have a chance to do today, we can do it in our podcast following this. Also, if you'd like to continue the conversation with these illustrious gentlemen, you can stay and be part of the podcast immediately following this from 2 to 2:30. So John and Eric, what did you hear and what advice do you have for us?
So I thought everyone just had great ideas. And I think the strongest really thought about how, what does your campaign want? And I think that when you set clear goals and decided, so this is what a win looks like, and then attach a strategy to and tactics to achieve that win, those are the strongest ones, because you're really setting out exactly what you're going to do from the get-go. I would also say that it was, to me, strongest when we said, we know that we have to appeal to a lot of different people. Let's start out to try to identify what unites people around the issue, rather than let's just bow to the divisiveness of the issue. And being able to say, we're going to find that 50% section in the middle and try to draw people towards the center, rather than try to cater to the polls.
I agree with John's point. I would add that you have selected 4, 5 of the most divisive, intractable issues that we're dealing with right now. And if you were to set out and seek to make these happen, if you tomorrow were put in charge of these issues, a very important thing would be to bring together all the different stakeholders working on these issues, all the different advocates fighting to make these, to work on these issues, and get everyone around a table and come up with one unified strategy. And that's what happened with the marriage equality effort in New York State. Many of the LGBT rights groups in New York State were not working together. They didn't like it. In many cases, they hated each other, right? People on the same side often fight with one another. So if you were to go out and take on the gun control issue tomorrow, I would say that everything you talked about today, bring all the different groups together around a table, and to the extent that it's possible, try to get everyone working together on one campaign.
Yeah, that's what we were able to do with First Step in criminal justice reform, is basically like, agree that you're not going to all agree all the time, but if you're all working together towards the same common goal, in this case of decarceration, and you basically acknowledge that each group brings their own, and each stakeholder brings their own strength and their own voice and their own constituency to the conversation, and let people go do what they're good at and what they're passionate about, and where they have set out that's been successful for them to bring about change. And it doesn't matter if you don't all agree on the same strategies. You all agree to the same end, And then what I have worked on that's been successful is then where you let everyone go out and be really good at what they do and bring their supporters along. That's where you're going to find success.
I'll do it on the mic. Okay. Each of these topics we've glossed on, but we haven't addressed straight on the issue of race. And in each of these situations, and I'm thinking about the feminist movement. Feminist movement was created by a whole group of women. But the leaders, the ones who we were taught were the leaders, but weren't just the leaders, were the white women. They were the ones, Susan B. Anthony, whoever, that were the ones that we sort of exalt. That the history is changing. We're talking much more about a wider range of women leaders. When we talk about these topics, race plays a huge part. We talked a little bit about that in death penalty, but we didn't talk about we talked about economics, but we didn't talk about race. So when you're thinking about these topics and these issues, and how you gather people from different groups together, think about how race may play into this, and how the meaning of gun violence is very different. NRA and the whole gun control thing, I was just whispering to Alex over here, actually gun control started with Black Power movement because they didn't like seeing black men carrying guns.
They still don't.
Right.
The NRA.
Different, yeah. So a lot of this knowing the history and then thinking about how race plays into it will really help you with when you're addressing whatever issue that you think is important.
Back to Santa in a minute. I think the interesting thing for us to see is how are these 5 going to change as the demographics in DC change. So back in December, I think you guys heard me say that I was optimistic long term for what's going to happen in DC. We brought 100 new people in, diverse people into the country, into the DC, and then over the next 2, 3, 4 elections, you're going to see it DC reflect more of what our country looks like. And are these issues going to go that way? Are we going to see movement on these issues as you start to be able to vote and take power and have a larger voice? Is this a New York-centric type, left-leaning group, or is the country going to become more moderate? And will these be the main issues you'll see the change in? So time will tell. All right, let me hand this over to you.
So let us thank John and Eric again for sharing their experiences, their stories, Thank you so much. And just want to do a little preview of when we're together next month for our final forum. So it's amazing how quickly it goes. So on Sunday, April 7th, 1 month from today, we are going to engage in something called Civic Shark Tank. Have you all seen Shark Tank, regular Shark Tank? So some have, some haven't. Basically, the idea is that today you engage with issues that you think about, but that we haven't had opportunity to talk about in any of our forums. Next month, we're going to revisit all of the forums that we've done. So we started with voting rights, then we did hyperpartisanship and the politics of hate. We engaged with immigration, criminal justice, freedom of expression, identity politics. We're going to revisit all of those issues. What are the open questions on our mind? What are the challenges? And what are some of the civic solutions that we can evolve, taking into account the different drivers that we engage with today, the different complexities that we've talked about? What are the things that we would want to put forward, and how would we do that effectively? You're going to go before the civic sharks, which some think of as Congress. They're going to evaluate your proposals on the basis of the power of the idea, the potential for impact, bipartisan appeal, and feasibility. So it's going to be a great opportunity for you to really synthesize the learning that we've been doing this year and apply it. We're also going to talk about how you can take some of this back to your schools and communities, because you really are civic spark plugs within your schools, and we want to equip you and support you in doing that even more. Any questions about Final Forum or anything else before we part? Yes, Lila. Great question. So if people heard Lila was saying, should we be prepping in advance? Always a good idea to prep in advance. We'll send out a reminder, the resources that you want to revisit. We also know that private schools are on break for 2 weeks and that public school students are very busy. So we're not expecting you to do a ton of work, but it is a good opportunity to revisit maybe some of the readings that you didn't get a chance to do the first time around, or other things that have come up. We're going to have opportunity to do lightning round, and so you'll get to engage with each issue, but then you'll choose one to focus on to develop a civic solution in more depth. So answer is there's not a ton that you need to do in advance, but all background knowledge that you can bring to bear will be helpful. Any other questions, thoughts, final words for our speakers or your fellow fellows? So we have, yes, Maya. So people heard that storytelling versus argument making. Is one more important than the other? In your microphone, please.
Making, do you mean being argumentative and like fight mentality? Tell me a little bit more about what you mean. Got it. First of all, I think in any winning
head versus heart. Almost?
Yeah, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an and. I think that your stories fit into the creation of a winning argument, and if you are consistently on message and everything that comes out of your campaign is cohesive and supports the final goal, and you agree to and remain on message. Now that doesn't mean you can't be nimble, you should be, but remain and stay on message, and you have and your stories support that message, right? You have a far higher chance of winning.
So if there are other questions that you would like raised during the podcast, it could be about anti-Semitism and hate speech and what was dealt with. It could be about Bernie's decision to do the launch of his campaign in Brooklyn last week. It could be about International Women's Day and strikes in Spain. Any issue around identity politics, around mobilizing different identity groups and ideologies, write them down on the paper, and you can put them on this front chair if you'd like to be part of the podcast stay. We also have more pizza that's on the table when you go out, so please help yourself and enjoy more daylight. Thanks, everyone.